The Trump administration has shifted into crisis management mode, following Zohran Mamdani's mayoral victory in New York, with senior White House officials convening emergency strategy sessions to determine how aggressively the federal government should respond to what they view as a direct challenge to presidential authority and conservative governance principles. Multiple sources inside the administration describe a palpable sense of alarm that extends beyond typical partisan rivalry, with advisors warning that allowing a self-proclaimed socialist to succeed in America's largest city could fundamentally alter the political landscape, heading into crucial midterm elections and embolden progressive movements nationwide. The internal debate within Trump's inner circle reveals deep divisions about tactical approach, with hardliners pushing for immediate confrontation through federal funding threats and regulatory pressure, while more pragmatic voices counsel restraint and allowing Mamdani to potentially fail on his own terms without creating a martyrdom narrative that benefits Democrats. National security officials have quietly raised concerns about immigration enforcement operations in New York, becoming flashpoints for civil unrest if the new mayor follows through on promises to actively resist ICE activities, creating scenarios where federal agents might face organized municipal resistance that could escalate into constitutional crises over the limits of local versus federal authority. Trump himself has oscillated between dismissive mockery and genuine anger in private discussions about Mamdani, according to administration insiders who describe the president as personally offended by the mayor-elect's confrontational victory speech and references to him. The president's transactional approach to governance makes him particularly sensitive to perceived disrespect, and his comment that Mamdani should be very nice to me reflected not just political calculation, but genuine expectation that local officials should demonstrate deference to federal power regardless of ideological differences or electoral mandates from their own constituents. Republican strategists outside the administration see New York as a critical test case that will shape conservative messaging for years, with the city potentially serving as either proof that progressive policies create urban dysfunction or as an embarrassing counterexample if Mamdani actually delivers improvements in quality of life and economic opportunity. Conservative think tanks have already begun producing research papers and policy briefs, arguing that New York under socialist governance will experience capital flight, rising crime, and fiscal collapse, creating a ready-made narrative framework that Republicans can deploy regardless of actual outcomes on the ground. Congressional Republicans are demanding coordination with the White House on how to leverage federal oversight and funding mechanisms to constrain Mamdani's policy options, with several committees announcing investigations into New York's management of federal grants and programs. These oversight efforts represent preparation for potential conflicts over how the city uses federal resources, with particular focus on immigration enforcement cooperation, education funding, and infrastructure projects, where the administration might claim violations of federal requirements, justify withholding money or imposing conditions that limit municipal autonomy. The Democratic response has been equally mobilized, with party leaders recognizing that New York has become a symbolic battlefield where the viability of progressive governance will be tested under hostile federal conditions. Senate Democrats are already preparing legislation to protect cities from arbitrary federal funding cuts and to establish clearer legal frameworks preventing presidential administrations from using discretionary authority to punish political opponents. Though such measures face obvious obstacles in a Republican-controlled chamber, the party's progressive wing sees this moment as an opportunity to demonstrate that bold left politics can withstand conservative opposition and deliver real results, making Mamdani's success or failure consequential for internal Democratic debates about future direction. Multiple federal agencies have received informal guidance from White House political operatives about increasing scrutiny of New York City programs and operations, with particular emphasis on immigration enforcement, federal grant compliance, and regulatory oversight that could create administrative obstacles for the incoming Mamdani administration without requiring dramatic funding cuts that might trigger immediate legal challenges. Department of Homeland Security officials describe planning for enhanced immigration enforcement operations in New York as both substantive policy implementation and deliberate political messaging designed to test whether the new mayor will actually follow through on sanctuary city commitments when confronted with aggressive federal action. The Department of Transportation has begun reviewing New York's pending applications for infrastructure funding, with what sources describe as unusual skepticism, raising technical questions and requesting additional documentation in ways that could delay project approvals and create political pressure on Mamdani to moderate his confrontational approach toward Washington. Career civil servants within these agencies express discomfort with what they perceive as politicization of traditionally technical review processes, but political appointees argue that enhanced scrutiny of a city whose mayor has declared opposition to federal policies represents appropriate oversight rather than partisan retaliation. Housing and urban development officials are examining New York's use of federal housing funds with attention to whether proposed rent control expansions and public housing initiatives comply with regulations designed to encourage private sector participation in affordable housing development, creating potential grounds for withholding future allocations or demanding policy modifications as conditions for continued federal support. The legal complexities involved in these disputes mean that conflicts could drag through courts for years, while creating uncertainty that itself becomes a form of pressure on municipal decision-making and investor confidence. The Justice Department has assigned additional attorneys to monitor New York's immigration enforcement cooperation, preparing potential legal action if the city actively interferes with federal operations beyond simply declining to assist ICE activities. The distinction between passive non-cooperation that courts have generally upheld as within local prerogatives and active obstruction that might constitute federal law violations represents a legal gray area that both sides expect to litigate extensively, with outcomes potentially establishing precedents affecting sanctuary jurisdictions nationwide. Environmental Protection Agency officials have received inquiries from White House political staff about New York's compliance with various federal environmental regulations, particularly regarding infrastructure projects and development approvals, creating another avenue for potential federal intervention in city operations. The layering of multiple agency oversight efforts suggests a coordinated strategy to create administrative burden and political pressure, rather than relying on any single dramatic confrontation that might galvanize opposition and create clear legal tests of federal authority. Intelligence and law enforcement agencies face particular sensitivity around New York operations, given the city's symbolic importance and dense media environment, where any federal action receives immediate national attention and scrutiny. FBI and federal law enforcement officials privately express concern that overly aggressive approaches could backfire politically, while potentially compromising actual security operations that require local cooperation, creating tension between political directives from administration leadership and operational judgments from career professionals about effective law enforcement strategy. Legal scholars across the ideological spectrum warn that the emerging confrontation between the Trump administration and Mamdani's New York represents a potential constitutional crisis that could force Supreme Court intervention on fundamental questions about federalism, executive power, and the limits of presidential authority to punish political opponents through administrative action. The constitutional framework governing federal-state relations was designed primarily to address conflicts between Washington and state governments rather than direct federal-municipal disputes, creating ambiguity about applicable legal standards when the president targets a specific city whose policies he opposes. The spending clause gives Congress substantial power to attach conditions to federal grants, but the extent to which a president can impose additional conditions or withhold appropriated funds without explicit congressional authorization remains contentious, with previous court decisions offering limited guidance for the specific scenario of a president seeking to pressure a newly elected mayor before he even takes office. Conservative legal theorists argue that the executive branch has broad discretion in implementing federal programs and conducting oversight, while progressive constitutional scholars contend that using this discretion to punish cities for their political choices violates principles of equal treatment and federalism that constrain arbitrary exercises of federal power. The immigration enforcement dimension raises particularly complex constitutional questions about the anti-commandeering doctrine that prevents the federal government from requiring state and local officials to enforce federal law, balanced against federal supremacy in immigration matters that limits how actively local governments can obstruct federal operations. Courts have generally held that cities cannot be forced to assist ICE, but also cannot actively interfere with federal enforcement, leaving substantial gray area about what constitutes impermissible interference versus permissible non-cooperation that both sides will likely test through increasingly confrontational actions. Civil rights organizations are preparing litigation, challenging any federal funding cuts or discriminatory treatment of New York as violations of equal protection principles and First Amendment prohibitions on government retaliation for protected speech, arguing that Mamdani's criticism of Trump represents core political expression that cannot constitutionally trigger federal punishment. These legal theories face uncertain prospects given the current Supreme Court's general deference to executive authority and skepticism of legal claims that constrain presidential discretion, but they represent the primary avenue for checking potential federal overreach if the administration pursues aggressive retaliation. State governments are watching the New York situation with alarm as a potential precedent for federal intervention in local governance, with even Republican governors expressing private concerns about implications for federalism if the Trump administration successfully establishes that cities with policies the president dislikes can face systematic federal pressure and punishment. The traditional conservative commitment to limiting federal power and preserving state and local autonomy creates awkward tensions when applied to conflicts where the ideological valence favors federal intervention against progressive local policies, potentially fracturing the Republican coalition between principled Federalists and partisan warriors, prioritizing political victory over constitutional consistency. International observers note parallels to conflicts in other democracies between national governments and opposition-controlled cities, where such disputes often escalate into broader crises threatening democratic norms and institutional stability. The American system's particular complexity regarding federal-state-local relations creates unique dynamics, but the underlying pattern of national executives seeking to punish and constrain opposition municipalities represents a concerning trend that scholars associate with democratic backsliding when it becomes normalized rather than exceptional. Whether American institutions prove resilient enough to constrain this conflict, or whether it spirals into sustained constitutional warfare, may significantly influence broader assessments of democratic health in the United States during this polarized era.